You think you're over it. But your reactions tell a different story. You flinch when someone raises their voice. You shut down when you feel misunderstood. You chase people who make you feel invisible. Because that feeling is familiar. And yet, you don't know why. You call it just how I am. But Carl Jung called it something else. The unconscious echo of childhood trauma. Not the loud, visible trauma. But the quiet moments you weren't held. The invisible needs no one noticed. The emotions you swallowed to keep the peace. Those moments didn't disappear. They buried themselves in your nervous system. In your relationships. In your self-worth. And even now, they speak. Through self-sabotage. Through emotional shutdowns. Through the war you fight with yourself every time love gets too close. This video isn't about blame. It's about finally understanding why you feel broken. When in truth, you were just forced to adapt too early. If that truth stirs something inside you, don't look away. Because what we're about to uncover could change everything. The wounds that grow in silence. Not all wounds leave scars on your skin. Some hide in your tone. In the way you apologize too much. In how you overthink every message before pressing send. Carl Jung believed that childhood trauma doesn't always come from what was done to you. Sometimes, it comes from what was missing. The hug that never came. The words you needed but never heard. The space to cry that was never safe to take. And when those needs aren't met, your psyche doesn't forget. It adapts. You become the helper, the pleaser, the strong one. You build a version of yourself that looks functional. But deep inside, a younger version of you is still frozen in a moment that was never processed. Jung called this inner split the beginning of the shadow. The part of you that holds all the pain, fear, and needs you had to silence to survive. In this video, we'll uncover how those forgotten wounds still shape your adult life. Your relationships, your triggers, your sense of worth. And more importantly, we'll explore how Jung's teachings offer a path back to integration and wholeness. If this resonates with something you've never been able to name, there's a guide for you. It's waiting in the pinned comment. A mirror for the parts of you still in the dark. And if this space feels like home, subscribe. We're not here to judge who you became to survive. We're here to help you remember who you were before the world told you to change. It doesn't begin with chaos. It begins with silence. The kind of silence where something in you shuts down. Not because you wanted to, but because it was safer that way. Maybe you were told you were too sensitive. Maybe your sadness was dismissed. Maybe your joy was too loud. Or your questions too much. So you adapted. Carl Jung taught that the psyche of a child is like soft clay. Easily shaped, deeply impressionable, and vulnerable to the messages it absorbs. And when a child is not met with understanding, that clay begins to crack in places no one can see. This is the beginning of psychic fragmentation. It's not a single traumatic event that shatters you. It's the slow, invisible process of disconnecting from yourself, just to stay connected to others. As children, we depend on love not just for survival, but for identity. So when love becomes conditional, we edit who we are, and exile the parts that were rejected. The anger you weren't allowed to express, it didn't disappear. It split off. The fear you were shamed for, it didn't vanish. It went underground. Jung called these exiled parts the shadow self. Not evil, not wrong. Just unacceptable in the environment you grew up in. And here's what makes this so dangerous. When a child is forced to suppress what they feel, they don't just lose the feeling. They lose access to themselves. You don't just learn to stay quiet. You learn that your voice doesn't matter. You don't just learn to behave. You learn that authenticity is unsafe. You don't just stop crying. You stop believing that someone will care if you do. The psyche splits to survive. But survival has a cost. As Jung explained, what remains in the unconscious continues to influence us from behind the scenes. So even decades later, those unprocessed experiences still govern your adult reactions. You may crave closeness, but feel overwhelmed the moment someone gets too near. You may chase success, but sabotage it once you receive it. You may offer support to everyone, yet feel invisible when you need help yourself. And you wonder, what's wrong with me? The truth? There's nothing wrong with you. There's just a younger version of you still trapped in a reality where their needs were unmet. This is the emotional time capsule Jung hinted at. The unconscious self preserving the trauma, waiting for the adult to finally return and witness what no one else could. But most people don't return. Because they don't remember. Why? Because our culture doesn't teach us to turn inward. It teaches us to move on. To let it go. To not be so dramatic. But trauma isn't something you remember intellectually. It's something your body carries. Something your nervous system stores. Something your identity adapts around. And so, you live fragmented. You show the world the parts of you that are functional. The responsible one, the achiever, the caretaker. But behind those roles is a silent room filled with the emotions you were never allowed to feel. And here's what Jung emphasized. What we suppress doesn't vanish. It organizes our lives. You may not remember the moment your sadness was rejected, but you'll feel its echo every time you try to open up and immediately shut down. You may not recall the exact day you stopped asking for help, but your independence now feels like loneliness, not empowerment. These are the echoes of fragmentation. Jung believed the path to healing wasn't about eliminating the past, but reclaiming it. Because when you begin to retrieve the lost parts of yourself, you also retrieve your capacity to feel, to trust, to belong, to yourself first. This isn't about digging up pain to suffer more. It's about understanding that your current emotional patterns were once brilliant strategies for survival. But now, they're prisons. And unless you bring those unconscious dynamics into the light, you'll keep reenacting them. In your relationships, your work, your identity. Healing, in Jung's view, is not becoming something new. It's removing everything that isn't truly you. Everything you picked up out of fear, shame, or survival. It's not easy. But it's sacred. Because each time you sit with your discomfort, instead of judging it, you're welcoming home a part of yourself that was once exiled. Each time you allow yourself to cry without apology, you're reparenting the child who had to stay strong too soon. Each time you say no without guilt, you're giving voice to a boundary that was never allowed to exist. That's how the psyche begins to stitch itself back together. Not through control, but through presence. Not through perfection, but through compassion. Carl Jung said, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." But to choose who you are, you must first meet who you've been forced to forget. And that meeting, that reunion, is where the war begins to end. You don't remember the exact moment it happened. But now, years later, you feel it every day. When someone criticizes you, you don't just feel hurt. You feel worthless. When a friend pulls away, you don't just feel disappointed. You feel abandoned. When love starts to feel real, you don't relax into it. You sabotage it. This isn't random. This is the unconscious at work. Carl Jung believed that what we do not make conscious will control our lives, and we will call it fate. And that's what most of us do. We call our patterns bad luck. Our relationships complicated. Our anxiety just part of life. But behind the symptoms is a story. And most of the time, it begins in childhood. You learn that love comes with conditions. So now you perform, overgive, or people please just to feel safe. You were told your anger was dangerous. So now you repress it, until it leaks out as passive aggression or emotional shutdown. You were ignored. So now you fear invisibility more than failure. These aren't personality traits. They're emotional survival mechanisms. And they shape everything, especially what you believe you're worthy of. Jung understood that the child doesn't just grow up. The child grows around the wound. You mature externally. But emotionally, you may still be that same 7-year-old hoping someone will finally see you. The mind is clever. It buries what's too overwhelming. But the body keeps the score. You flinch, tense, freeze. Not because of the present moment, but because your nervous system is still wired for a threat that ended long ago. This is how trauma travels with you. Not in memory, but in reaction. You overthink simple texts. You rehearse conversations in your head. You say I'm fine when you're clearly not. And worst of all, you don't even notice it anymore. Because this isn't unusual for you. It's become your normal. But just because it's familiar doesn't mean it's true. That inner voice that tells you you're too much, or not enough, or hard to love, isn't your voice. It's a repetition of someone else's silence. Someone else's emotional absence. Someone else's inability to meet you where you needed them most. And unless you interrupt that pattern, you'll keep carrying their story. As if it were yours. That's the hidden cost of unprocessed trauma. You live out someone else's limitations as if they were facts about yourself. You tell yourself, I'm just bad at relationships. I'm always overreacting. I can't let people get too close. But what if none of that is true? What if those behaviors are actually the language of your shadow? The part of you Jung said carries everything you've been forced to deny. The shadow doesn't just hold rage or sadness. It holds tenderness, desire, longing, hope. And it shows up in adulthood through self-sabotage. You destroy what you most crave because you don't believe you deserve it. Hyper-independence. You don't ask for help because asking once ended in disappointment. Over-control. You plan, overthink, and obsess because the unknown once meant pain. Emotional numbness. You're so used to not feeling that aliveness itself becomes uncomfortable. And here's what hurts most. The people around you don't see the war you're fighting. Because you're high-functioning. You get things done. You smile. You show up. But deep down, you're exhausted. Not from doing too much, but from feeling too little for too long. This isn't a flaw. It's a wound. Jung believed the only way to stop being ruled by these unconscious forces was to bring them into awareness. To name them, to feel them, to re-own what was exiled. But that takes courage. Because the shadow is not a monster. It's the version of you that once needed love. And never got it. So now, it speaks through your adult life. Through panic before intimacy. Through anger when someone gets too close. Through detachment when vulnerability knocks on the door. You don't need to fix these parts. You need to understand what they're protecting. Because every overreaction is a doorway. Every shutdown moment is a signpost. Every time you run from love, from rest, from joy. It's not self-sabotage. It's a younger version of you. Trying to keep you safe. In the only way it ever knew how. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But first, you must uncover who you became. When being yourself wasn't safe." And that's what we're doing here. We're peeling back the survival patterns. We're translating the symptoms. We're listening to the parts that no one else ever did. Because the moment you understand why you react the way you do, everything begins to change. Not instantly, but deeply. You start to pause. You start to breathe. You start to choose again. Not from fear, but from presence. That's not just growth. That's healing. And it's available. The moment you're ready to stop performing your pain and start listening to it. Most people try to heal by running away from the pain. They change cities. They change partners. They bury themselves in work, achievements, distractions. But no matter where they go, there's one thing they always carry with them. The self they abandoned. Carl Jung taught that the true path to healing isn't escape. It's return. Not return to the past, but to the parts of you still living there. The child who still doesn't feel safe. The teenager who still fears being seen. The adult who learned to survive instead of live. This is the heart of Jung's work, individuation. A word that means much more than self-discovery. It means becoming whole. Not perfect. Not polished. Whole. It's the sacred process of reclaiming the parts of you that were exiled. Not because they were wrong, but because they were too raw for the world you grew up in. The anger. The sadness. The softness. The dreams. Everything you once buried to be accepted now waits quietly to be remembered. In the moment you turn inward, not to fix, but to feel, you begin the return. The return to your own truth. Your own rhythm. Your own voice. But here's the part no one tells you. Healing doesn't feel good at first. It feels messy. Unfamiliar. Lonely, even. Because you're stepping out of an identity built on coping. And creating one rooted in truth. You may lose people. You may outgrow patterns. You may face emotions you've spent decades avoiding. But for the first time, you'll also feel real. Because you're no longer living to be understood by others. You're living to understand yourself. And with every truth you allow, every boundary you honor, every emotion you welcome, you begin to stitch your soul back together. You begin to feel what peace actually is. Not the absence of pain, but the absence of resistance to who you really are. That's what freedom feels like. Not control. Not certainty. But presence. You no longer need to pretend you're okay. You are okay, because you've stopped abandoning yourself for approval. You no longer ask, "What's wrong with me?" You ask, "What part of me is finally speaking?" This shift is everything. Because the more you bring your unconscious into awareness, the less it controls you. You pause when triggered. You speak with clarity, not defense. You say no, not to push people away, but to protect the child within you who was never allowed to say it. Jung's approach doesn't give you quick answers. It gives you a language. A way to listen to your shadow with compassion. instead of fear. A way to hold space for all your parts. Even the ones that still feel messy, insecure, or not enough. Because those parts? They're not broken. They're waiting. Waiting to be met with the presence you've been giving everyone else. That's what healing really is. Returning home to yourself. And no one can do that work for you. But you don't have to do it alone. Jung believed that the journey of individuation was deeply personal, but never isolated. It requires reflection, ritual, silence, and often, guidance. Not someone to tell you who you are, but someone to help you remember. And that remembering becomes a revolution. You stop performing. You stop explaining. You stop negotiating your value. You begin to walk differently. Breathe differently. Love differently. Not because life got easier, but because you did. You became softer where you once shut down. Stronger where you once collapsed. Wiser where you once reacted. That's the power of integration. The shadow no longer haunts you. It guides you. It becomes your compass, pointing toward the wounds that still need love. The needs that still want a voice. The truths that still long to be spoken. And little by little, your energy changes. You begin to attract people who see the real you. Because you're no longer hiding. You set boundaries without guilt. Because you know what it costs to live without them. You rest without shame. Because you finally understand that rest isn't laziness. It's repair. This is what it means to be free. Not to live without pain, but to live with all of yourself. Without apology. To no longer need to escape your inner world. Because now, it finally feels safe to stay. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." But that acceptance? It's also the most liberating. Because the moment you stop running from yourself, you begin to meet the life that's been waiting for you all along. There comes a moment when survival is no longer enough. A moment when the version of you that kept it all together, smiling, performing, overthinking, avoiding, starts to crack under the weight of everything you never got to feel. And maybe you're there now. Maybe you've already begun to sense that the exhaustion you carry is not just physical, but spiritual. A soul-level fatigue. From years of being fragmented. Carl Jung knew this moment well. He didn't see it as weakness. He saw it as the invitation. The invitation to finally stop running. And start remembering. Because the real you was never broken. Just buried. Under roles. Under silence. Under stories you were never meant to carry. You don't heal by becoming someone new. You heal by returning to the one who's always been waiting underneath. That's what this journey is. Not self-improvement. Self-reclamation. And if something inside you stirred while listening, there's a reason. There's a deeper part of you asking to be seen. And I created a guide for exactly that. It's not a fix. It's a mirror. You'll find it in the pinned comment. And if this message felt like a quiet yes inside your chest, subscribe. Here, we don't chase healing. We remember it. One breath. One truth. One homecoming at a time. And let me leave you with this. The war ends. The moment you stop waiting to be rescued. And choose to return to yourself. That's where your wholeness begins. That's where everything begins.